and good evening. I'm Steve Willis, co-founder of Hope Sheds Light, and on behalf of my partners Ron Rosetto and Arvo Prima, we welcome you to our Finding Hope for Life recovery meeting. I like Tuesday nights very much. We get to be with you, and thank you for all our friends on Facebook for joining us again. For those of you who are new, let me tell you about Hope. Hope is a family-focused nonprofit agency. Our mission is to raise awareness and to educate individuals and families in the community about the impact of addiction by having the courage to share our personal experiences, by offering our strength and wisdom, and by providing hope and resources that lead to the long-term recovery of the entire family. And a part of our mission is to remove as best we can the fear and stigma that surrounds this disease. We do that by offering a loving and hopeful and safe environment that allows families to heal and brings wellness to the community. And we do that through this meeting. We started this Finding Hope meeting meets on the second and fourth Tuesday of every month in the beautiful Holy Cross Lutheran Church where we are. And then on the first and third Tuesdays, we have our Finding Recovery for Life support meetings. And that meets at our Hope Sheds Lights office at 253 Chestnut Street in Toms River. We also have meetings in Red Bank now, every other Monday, which we're very proud to announce. And on Thursdays, we have grief meetings for those who have lost loved ones to addiction. Details are in our website, of course, but the weekly meetings on Mondays and Tuesdays, they're open to anybody and everybody that's affected by addiction. Our hope is that by us sharing with you and you with us, you'll have the courage to change the way you think and feel about addiction and therefore become healthier. So the format for tonight, our Finding Hope meeting, the first part of it is an educational piece. We have, every other week here, we have talented colleagues that talk about a certain aspect of treatment, prevention, and recovery. Tonight we have a brilliant speaker, I can tell you. What we do, and the educational piece lasts about 45, 50 minutes, and then we break out into groups to discuss what we've heard, to discuss how addiction and substance misuse affects our daily lives, and importantly, we talk about what we can do to take care of ourselves, to help each and every one of us move forward on our own journey toward recovery. So thank you again for being with us. You are great. Let me introduce our speaker. And I love her. I do. She's brilliant and she's thoroughly and completely awesome in all ways. It's our CEO, Pam Capaci. Please welcome Pam.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Finding Hope. I am very notorious for starting out our meetings with a little brief meditation, so I would like you to please get comfortable in your seats. Put your feet flat on the ground if you can, and your hands either by your side or even better, palms up. Close your eyes and just get comfortable in your own space. If you can, let your weight sink into your waist and start to breathe fully in through your nose, filling not just your lungs, but your stomach with air. Pass your lungs, filling your stomach with air, and then release that air through your mouth. Again, pulling in through your nose, deep breath, release. And while you're breathing in, sink comfortably into your seat and think about the word peace. And as you're breathing out, release. Release your stress. Breathing in calm. Release anxiety. Breathing in deep, filling your stomach with air. Follow your breath down through your neck and shoulders and relax your neck and shoulders. Again, breathing fully in, following that breath down deep. Let your breath go into your arms, into your fingertips. Shake your hands. Rotate your wrists, release stress and anxiety that might be stuck there. And while you're comfortably getting relaxed in your seat, I'm going to ask you to go with me in a little bit of a guided meditation. It'll feed into what we're going to talk about later. So while you're breathing in and relaxing and being peaceful, I want you to imagine a tree in your mind. If you were a tree, what kind of tree would you be? a big oak tree, a pine tree. I want you to see every aspect of that tree, branches, leaves, big, small, winter, spring, summer. Are you fully bloomed? Is it fall? Are your leaves shedding? Take in the senses around you, the breeze, birds. Relax. Feel the earth on your feet become the roots of your tree. How deep do they go? Are you a young tree or an old tree? Take one more deep breath in. Again, try to fill your whole stomach with air. Push out. And when you're ready, you can come back to the room. Thank you for indulging me. I might ask you what kind of tree you were a little later in the session, but tonight's topic is about change. And what I'd like you to do is just a little brief exercise with me, just together, just put your hands and clasp your hands together like this. Sit that way for a minute. Get comfortable. And what I'm going to ask you to do is take whatever thumb is on top and switch it. See how that feels. Maybe a little uncomfortable at first. Lots of uncomfortable at first. And just sit with that for a minute. All right, so you can relax or sit however you want to sit. How many people felt a little uncomfortable when they switched their thumb? So that's because even the slightest bit of change can create a sense of uncomfortability for us. Like it resonates like physically. But did anyone start to feel like a little bit normal in the new position when you sat with it for a little while? Did it start to feel less uncomfortable? And some are saying yes and some are saying no. And that's just a little brief example about how difficult change can be, but how if we stick with change and we ride it out a bit, we get to this place of new normal. We might not ever feel the way we used to feel, but a new sense of normal can emerge through change, even though no matter what, change can be difficult and doesn't feel quite right to us. So what I want to do, instead of talking about the theory of change and pre-contemplation and contemplation, I thought maybe tonight I could share with you a little bit about information from one of my favorite authors and social workers, and that's a woman named Brené Brown. She speaks a lot on the topic of addiction, the topic of fear and shame and the courage to change. And so Heather is going to pass out a piece of paper that we're going to work off of. But I want to bring you to this tree before we start talking about some of this. And I want to thank Heather for her artwork, because I would have drawn like a stick figure tree and would not have had pretty leaves and things like that. But I want to bring your attention to this tree because while you were meditating, I asked you to think about yourself as a tree and define for yourself what kind of tree you think you are. In life, basically, the only thing that's constant is change. Change is just present for all of us constantly. And if you stand rigid, like a rigid tree through change, what can happen to you? Exactly, you can crack, right? You can break. Through a big windstorm or a hurricane or a tornado, depending on what life hits you or throws at you, if you remain rigid, most often you will snap. However, if you're the kind of tree that allows yourself to bend and flow through the storm, what can happen for you? Right? You can change with the circumstances that are being thrown at you, but we're going to talk about even with that, if you bend and flow too much, you might also snap from your roots, which is, might not be a good thing. For some of us, we'll talk about the need to maybe possibly build a new tree and develop some new roots. But as you can see, this tree has some green leaves and some brown leaves. It's got some flowers, and some branches don't have flowers. And really, the strength of a tree, whether it's healthy or not healthy, the same thing, and just as an analogy, the same thing for us oftentimes relates to our roots and our ability to remain rooted through change and bend back and forth without getting uprooted or snapping. Depends oftentimes on what our roots are made up of. So in the context of addiction and recovery, first looking at addiction and where do we stand in our evolution with this disease, we want to look at our roots, and so oftentimes our roots have mental illness, our roots might have a family history of addiction, our roots may have a lot of stress, anxiety, our roots might have divorce, they may have some sort of abuse, physical, mental, or emotional abuse as a child. We might also have a spattering of things, so we could have roots that have some really positive, strong aspects to them. We might have, maybe very talented at certain things. We may have had some assets in our life, like strong attachment to grandparents or a teacher. We may have a great education. We might come from a family with lots of resources. All of these things mixed together kind of create who we are as a human being. But I'm going to focus on the idea that some of us, while we're dealing with this disease, need to look at the aspects of our roots that might be creating some inability or some dysfunction for us in the analogy of a tree up here in our lives, like if this were our daily lives, and how what our roots are made up of can impact our ability to change or not change through a storm. So I don't know how many of you were trees that stayed rigid, but oftentimes as family members, we remain sort of fixed on our approach on how we want to work with or support or help our loved one through addiction. And some of us are here tonight because our approach might not necessarily be working. And so what we want to ask you to do is create change for yourself, open up room for change for you to look at this from a different perspective. And for those of us in the room who are also either active addiction or in recovery, the amount of change that we're asking you to do is incredible, because oftentimes all of your skills, all of your everything that you've developed over time to support your addiction, you have to give up now in early recovery, and you have to actually rebuild from scratch oftentimes your roots, as an adult. When you have to do that, you're starting out as like a fledgling, like a small tree that has very fragile roots. So a storm comes in on that, and you can snap pretty easily. So that's why we hear terms like people, places, and things, or needing for you to rebuild your peer group, rebuild your social outlet, rebuild where you work and live long enough, and to stabilize and to reroot yourself so that you can handle some of the things that life throws at you just on a regular basis. And for anybody in the room who's saying, well, I don't have a family history of addiction, and I don't have a family history of mental illness, you can most likely identify situations in your life that you can sort of implant here in place of those things, that at least you know what it's like to have to deal with a stressful situation or deal with something new that you maybe have not developed a set of skills that helps you manage that. And that's really what we're talking about. So, did you pass out a piece of paper? So, Brené Brown talks about the ability to change your story. And so for those of us who are in the room tonight that didn't expect to be sitting in a church dealing with a loved one who has an addiction and you can't really figure out, like, how did I get here? And you have a story that you're building in your head around this, or you have anger or resentment, or you have fear and anxiety, because we all share that. What we're suggesting tonight is that one of the things that you get to change for yourself is your story about how you're here, and the story about where you are today in your journey through recovery and addiction. And everything else around, you build up your story, and it can be filled with stigma and negativity, or it can be filled with hope and positivity. And so tonight we're going to look at steps that we can take to switch our story out and get to reframe and talk about who we are as people. So I did not write in here, the things that I discussed, but, talking about a tree, this is a fairly healthy tree with some, spatterings of brown leaves and some flowerless branches. So the roots on a tree like this, or a person like this, might have in it a history, family history of addiction, but maybe not, on both sides, or the severity of that addiction might not be as severe as some other families. You may have, a dysfunctional family in terms of anger and fighting and stress and divorce, and you might have financial struggles. You may have lost a home. You may have had to move through some pretty critical things, and other trees might just be filled with early childhood trauma, physical abuse, those things that really create a tree that has a very difficult time building out healthy leaves and branches. But what I'd like us to do is think about a blank tree as an analogy again for who we are as people, and begin to identify how do we move from, and this is sort of the first thing on your handout, when we talk about when we deny our stories, they define us. That means we let the world tell us who we are and what we should feel about ourselves. When we push away things that are hurtful and pretend that struggles don't exist, the hurt and that owns us. Then it becomes something that rules our life. It rules our decisions. It rules how we feel about each other, and it manifests itself over and over, and it increases the stress and struggles in your life, as opposed to releasing them. And unfortunately, our world can be set up that way. Our world can be set up to reinforce and look at the negative over and over again. It's not very often that we walk into a support place, either for counseling or for here, where we walk in and we hear about our strengths, right? We come in and we share our strength and we share our struggles. This is a model that says, why don't we come in and identify what we're proud of, what our strengths are, and why don't we let that define for us who we are and who we're going to be, even in a storm. Because when we own who we are, when we can look at this, and we can identify for ourselves what goes down here without shame, and when we own it, then it doesn't own us. When we are open about it and we can identify it, we get to move through it, and then we get to say, all right, now I'm going to define for myself who I am and what my story has to say, about me and to myself and to other people. And that has changed. That is very difficult, because that's not typically how we enter life, especially when we're hit with the storm of addiction. So what we sometimes often do in families that have, because addiction is a family disease, and whether you're a family member or an individual, oftentimes what we try to do is smooth over, are there any fixers in the room? That we try to walk on eggshells and make sure that we're not upsetting the apple cart, and we don't want, anything to blow up, and we can pretend that there aren't real hot buttons in the middle of our living room. Does that sound familiar to anybody here? So when we do that, what happens is we just don't address the things that are hurting us and the issues that are bothering us, and they kind of stockpile up and up and up, and then eventually they spill out inappropriately somewhere else. So the first thing that we have to own if we want change and we want to be able to define our story for ourselves as families, we have to acknowledge some of the roots that might not be healthy. We have to acknowledge maybe as a mom where I've had to acknowledge where I've made mistakes with my children. As a wife, I needed to acknowledge where I made mistakes as a wife. And I have to own that and not let it own me. And the minute I do that, I'm releasing that as like this choke around my neck, and I can define then for myself how I want to be about that, how I want to interpret that for myself. So I think for you, on this sheet, what I really would like you to do is maybe think about some things that you feel some resentment about, especially if you're living in active addiction. There are so many situations where we, as family members, can make sacrifices that we don't want to make. We can make compromises that we know deep inside probably aren't the right compromises because we're making them out of fear, and we're making them without acknowledging the issues that I'm talking about tonight. So we have to have the courage, this is about courage to change. We have to have the courage to at least acknowledge them, even to ourselves, as a first step. And that's why it would be really helpful if you could write down, I don't need to collect this, and you don't necessarily have to write this down tonight, but it would be really helpful for you to begin your journey of change and empowerment by just writing down maybe the top 2 or 3 issues that you feel you're starting to have a resentment or anger towards, or that you might be so overwhelmed by that you just want to isolate and go in your room and not deal with this and really just and let this situation perpetuate. Because that's the first step. However, whether it's something that's current in today's, in your daily life today, or if it's something from your past that you've just ignored and decided you don't want to deal with it, I would suggest that this first step for you is just getting it out. It's just say it, write it down, and get it out. And then the next step, obviously, would be to, see what pieces of that you might be able to address. But right now, all I'm saying is identify them for yourself. It's pretty amazing what happens internally when you just say it. Just admit, I'm really angry about this. I think I share often my family situation, and there's dynamics in my house that I'm just resentful for. I'm not really going to do anything about it because I'm happy that I'm with my family and I'm happy the way things are, but there are pieces of it that just piss me off and make me resentful, and expressing that is really helpful. It's a relief. I just get it out, and the long-term solution is just that. It's a long-term solution. So in the day-to-day, I just have to be honest about what it is that's really bothering me, and that way it doesn't control me anymore. So sometimes it's not about, you write it down and then the next step is you eradicate it from your life. A lot of this stuff is so seemingly insurmountable. A lot of what we're dealing with is so oftentimes there's such a long path through healing or to healing that it's not something that you should expect to change like today. But you have to take your first step into that journey of change, and if you want to, and this can be a nice first step for you to do that. Again, if you don't do it, the analogy of staying very rigid can really break us down. So for us, obviously, we're not trees, but if we snap, that translates into getting sick, in getting overwhelmed. Some people have nervous breakdowns. Some people get physically ill. Some people lose their marriages. Some people lose their jobs. Some people, they have no friends left. So it shows up by that snapping. It shows up in many, many ways. The next step that is, another step you can take in having the courage to start to rewrite your story and the courage to change, is to stop pretending that your family histories are perfect or that they don't include addiction or mental illness. or some other circumstances if it's not addiction and mental illness. And our hope is that to write a new story and pass that legacy for emotional honesty and health down to our children. So let me share with you what that means to me. So by being honest about my history, and I've shared this with my children, so in my history, in my family history, there's addiction on both sides. There's divorce, there's physical abuse, so there's domestic violence, there's sexual abuse, there is all kinds of chaos that my parents lived through. And so then you have my generation, and we lived through elements of physical abuse, we lived through poverty, we lived through physical and emotional abuse, a divorce, and I spent most of my life growing up in a boarding school. So there's all kinds of those issues. Now my children, their experience too, had divorce and chaos and family dysfunction and physical and emotional abuse. But at a certain point, we got honest about that. And at a certain point, I didn't try to hide the reality of what they were experiencing from them. And what I did, and what this is talking about, is I opened up the opportunity for the next generation to break the cycle of the generation before. So by being honest with my kids about where we came from and what we were experiencing, but how we got to rewrite the rest of their childhood and the rest of our story as a family, because it didn't own me anymore. I let go of the shame. I let go of the guilt. I wasn't parenting from that position of guilt anymore. And it opened up the door for a whole new story for me and my children. And sometimes it takes more than one generation. I mean, for them, they're taking this one step further than I was able to take it. My parents took it one step further than their parents were able to take it. And that's what Brene Brown is referring to here, that when we get honest about whatever it is that we're fearful of and whatever it is that we're ashamed of, when we allow that ourselves to let go of the chokehold that has on us, we open up the opportunity for a different legacy for our children and the people in our lives. So why is that important here? Because so much of what happens in the roots of an individual who's struggling with addiction is that those roots of dishonesty, the roots that are, whatever is down here, whatever happened in whatever the circumstances is, then there's this layer of shame and denial and guilt that does not allow a tree to grow healthy until you release that chokehold on yourself and on your roots and on your children and on what they're able to accomplish. So it can fuel active addiction. It can fuel the inability to stabilize in recovery. And the reverse is true. If you're able to face some of these situations and be honest about them and move through them, it can fuel recovery. The honesty and the hope can fuel your recovery as a family and as an individual, with or without each other. So as a family member, if you're sitting in here, you have an opportunity to change your story for you, and the person that you love may or may not embrace that initially. Depends on so many factors, but you get to heal, and you get to move into and through recovery, and they get to join you at some point or not. But you at least are holding that torch of recovery for the next generation and for the legacy that you want to leave for you and your family. So again, what I would suggest you do with this handout is just, quietly by yourself, just write down the things that you feel you may have to become honest with between you and one other person, whoever that person might be. You and God, you and a loved one, you and the person who's struggling with this disease, you and yourself. But I would say you and one other person, you need to write these things down and begin to just let that, just writing them down is a good way to get it out of your system. But if you could share with one other person, it's just transformative. And then The last step that she talks about is we must own our failures and mistakes so that we can learn and grow. It's hard, but I've seen how it becomes part of a family and organizational cultures and unleashes innovation and creativity. It doesn't feel comfortable, but courage rarely does. So once, again, this is really taking the first two stages that we talked about and requesting that you move into action, that you look at yourself in the mirror, that you own the pieces of whatever mistakes that are going on that are yours, and you allow yourself to learn and grow through that, and therefore allow other people to learn and grow through that. Because it's not about the situations that we're dealing with, it's how we deal with those situations that really begin to define us and our stories. So we're either going to deal with them with a sense of courage and honesty and allow those emotions to define our story, or we're going to continue to deal with them through what addiction would love for us to do, which is to continue to deal with them through fear and shame and doubt, which keeps us stuck and frozen and allows someone else or something else to define what our stories are for ourselves. I don't know if anybody has any questions for me right now or comments about anything that I just said. No. So what do you think? You want to? Yeah. What do you think should go down here? Let's not focus on the negative. If we want to start building strong roots and redefine who we are as people, what do we need to put into our roots in order for that to happen? Just some of the themes that we just talked about. Anybody? Mm-hmm.
If you have mental illness, you go get help.
Correct. Yep. Anybody else want to throw something out? In the back?
Love.
Love. Nice. Self-love, love for each other, love for another. Mm-hmm.
Need to find someplace safe.
Safe place. Here, hopefully, and other places. Yes?
Trust.
Trust. Mm-hmm. Honesty, yes, that's weird. Forgiveness. Openness. Now, if I was the artist, I would start to have a whole lot of color up here. You don't have to do that. Anything else? Mm-hmm. Courage. I had a teacher once at an acupuncture school I went to where she just said that, fear and breath combined equals courage. So you can't have courage if you don't have a little fear. And this is scary. So when you're in the face of fear, you take in a deep breath and release that fear. You create a sense of courage for yourself. So any other things in our roots that we need over here? No? So tonight's really the message is we have to create the conditions for change if we want change to occur. We have to be courageous about it. We have to be open and honest. We need to seek out trustful people that we can share some of these things with. We need to love ourselves and others. And we need to be forgiving of ourselves and others. Yes?
You really want to surround yourself with healthy people as well?
Seek out other people who are on this path of courage and defining themselves in terms of hope and healing and power and empowerment, and not necessarily, that's how you can determine, when we say surround ourselves with healthy people, how do we know? You can tell by the language that they're using. You can tell by the story that they tell about themselves. And if they're rooted in their history, which we didn't put in here, but if they're rooted in the shame and the doubt and the guilt and the fear and the disease, is their language and is their story rooted in a sense of hope and love and positivity and trustworthiness and openness? That's how we can define for ourselves. And we don't know, so it's why you're here. It's hopefully in the breakout sessions after the education session, you'll start to hear stories of hope. You'll start to understand and learn from others how to take those first steps. I don't even know what time it is, but I'm not worried. I'm not gonna worry. Any other questions or thoughts or comments about this? So I hope that everybody has a little bit of courage and a little bit of ability to take in a deep breath and take the first step towards change. I recommend that you look up Brene Brown. She has some wonderful TED Talks on YouTube. Really, really valuable information. Really bright lady, also very real and easy to understand and honest in her approach. So nobody has any more questions for me. That's it. Thank you.